Hello everyone, it is I, Ryan, also known as thelovebat, and I'm just going to be joining in with everyone today to go ahead and do a little bit of a part 0 for an upcoming Let's Play I'm going to be doing with Baldur's Gate Enhanced Edition. And so the part 0 video is just going to kind of go through character creation and things like that for people who may not be all that familiar with these games or with the old sort of Dungeons and Dragons kind of rules and things like that. In an upcoming episode, we kind of got into things kind of quickly and we imported characters to kind of save ourselves time. But in hindsight, I thought it would be a good idea to just kind of be like, oh, well, a part 0 video could be good to show people what character creation is like. And of course, there's two ways you can do it. You can just start a new game and just start fresh, dive right into the game. Or you can pre-generate a character and kind of save them for later when you might feel in the mood to play them, just so that way you have all of the character creation options already done there. So you can pre-generate a character and just do this. And then you get all of your good old options here, and so we're going to go all through all of them. And it gives you some kind of tips here of things that you might want to do, and you can also import a character that you previously created. I don't know why you'd want to do that for pre-generating a character, but it's useful if you want to just dive right into the game if you're just doing a start a new game option. So you go to the gender here, and you'll get some different portraits to choose from along with your gender. So male portraits are there, and then female portraits are here. And then this is the larger size portrait that will show up in like your character record screen, which is like just your general character sheet kind of screen. And then this is the picture that will show up in like the main game screen, like where you can, when you're actually in the game itself and when you're playing the bulk of the game, this is the thing that'll show up in your sort of where all of your party members will show up, and it'll be over here onto the right of the screen in smaller portraits. So usually I play male characters, but female characters are pretty cool too. I like to play them now and again. And the Enhanced Edition also added in some extra portraits for both genders. So you can see these portraits right here are from the Enhanced Edition. And then you have more portraits for male characters as well. If you scroll all the way down here, you get some of these portraits down over here. And then if you scroll down far enough, then you get like custom character portraits that you might have in one of your game folders for custom portraits. And so you might have two images show up here for the same character. So this is a larger size portrait, and then this is a smaller sized one that shows up in the sort of main screen, and then this bigger one is for the character record sort of portrait. So since the character that I'm going to be playing is using this portrait, I'm going to go with this one just for the purposes of showing off. Oops, I went with switch the gender first. Custom portraits will show up for either gender no matter what the portrait is down at the bottom there. So for male and female options, custom character portraits will show up regardless, but if you want to play a female character here and choose a custom portrait, you do that. And then you can go for race. Now, races are a lot similar in this game to what they are in 5th edition. Of course, there are some options that are not here, such as tieflings and things like that. Asamirs aren't here either. And so lots of those sorts of sort of half races are usually restricted more to the sort of default half-elf, half-orc kind of races. So being a bit of an older rule set, you'll have a bit more sort of, maybe not so much generic, but more just standard options for character creation. But, I mean, there's a good variety. They each have their own strengths and weaknesses. Humans, they are the only race that can dual class, which is basically a special way of having multiple classes at one time. It allows you to get some really powerful combinations, but there will be a bit of downtime with that, because when you dual class, essentially what happens is that you can start off as one class, like say a thief, for example. You can start off as a thief, and then when you gain a certain number of levels in thief, you can decide to dual class, which means that you stop gaining levels in your first class, and then you start getting levels in a second class, and you never return to gaining levels in your first class. So it's kind of like you're giving up an old profession to learn a new one, but eventually you'll gain enough experience in your second class to where you'll end up gaining the abilities of your first class once you get high enough in level in your second class. So it's something to where you have downtime trying to gain your old level, your old class levels back, but once you reach that combination, then it becomes very, very powerful later on. And so it's something that only humans can do. They don't get any special race bonuses or penalties, but dual classing by itself can be a very powerful option, and it's also the only way where you can end up playing as a kit. And a kit is like a special subclass, which is common in 5th edition that everyone gets to choose a subclass, but in the old sort of 2nd edition, 3rd edition mishmash of rules that Baldur's Gate uses, essentially it's more of an optional thing to where you can either just play the base class, or you can play a kit, which is like a subclass that comes with advantages or disadvantages. So that makes humans pretty special. They're not able to multi-class like other races do, which basically means you start off as 2 classes and advance equally in each of them for the remainder of like the entire game. So it's more of a, you start off as 2 and you always have both of those classes, and it's a bit more newcomer friendly because you don't have to worry about when to dual class and having downtime to gain your old class back. But it's still, both are valid options. And elves, they have some pretty interesting bonuses here. 90% resistance against charm and sleep magic. That's kind of similar to some of their 5th edition abilities. But it's very, very strong in the first game, where it'd be very hard to resist those kinds of effects, and they can be kind of strong. So that's actually very, very cool to have. Infravision, which is like dark vision in the old edition rules. It is not really important in these games, but I mean, it's there. It doesn't really ever play a role in my experience, but it's there. Theco bonus, that's basically, Theco stands for to hit armor class of 0, which basically means that's how much you have to roll on the d20 when you make like an attack to be able to hit someone who has an armor class of 0, which is generally a good armor class. The way the armor class worked is the lower armor class the better. So usually you just wanted a lower Theco and you have an easier time hitting guys, basically. And the game kind of computes that for you, so it's a bit newcomer friendly in that regard, but for tabletop it's more complicated. But a Theco bonus of bows, short swords, and long swords, those are all very good weapons, so elves are a pretty good pick if you want to be an archer type of character, because they also get +1 bonus to dexterity. And the -1 penalty to constitution doesn't hurt as much if you're an archer and you're not in melee combat very much. But it also makes for a pretty potent combination if you want to go ahead and be a multi-class, like a fighter mage, for example, and combine abilities that can make up for the fact that you don't have as many hit points of constitution penalty, but you get a Theco bonus with some pretty good weapons, and you can have a higher dexterity, so you can, you know, sit back and use a bow, or you can go up and slice and dice with a couple of swords. So they're a pretty good pick. And you also notice here that different races may end up getting different thief skill modifiers. That's what these are: open locks, pickpockets, etc. So depending on race, you may get some bonuses here, or in this case a penalty for an elf to open locks. And you also get some flavor text up here with the general lore of the race, at least in the Forgotten Realms and Dungeons and Dragons kind of realm, and it mentions some other different kinds of elves that you might be able to read about in some of the 5th edition source books and things like that. You can't really specifically play as any of these, it's just generally you play as an elf or you don't. But it's kind of cool that you have flavor text up here. Half-elf is kind of similar to elves, but they don't get as many of the good stuff. They don't get the penalty of the Constitution, which is good, which makes them better fighters in some ways for melee. But they don't get as good of bonuses. They don't get the Theco bonus. Their resistance to charm and sleep is much less, which is it's not as reliable as a defensive bonus. The main reason to play a half-elf is if you want to play a certain class that other races couldn't be, which it might be the case for like bards and some multi-class combinations. And then dwarves. Dwarves are, as in any edition, they're generally a very strong race as far as being warriors and fighters and things like that, and it's no different here. They get saving throw bonuses based on how high their constitution is, and dwarves naturally will have generally very high constitution, so their saving throws in these games will be very, very good as far as tanking certain nasty spell effects or nasty damaging spells. They'll succeed on saving throws much more often, and they're just really good to have around. They're very stout, very tough, lots of hit points. The dexterity penalty isn't too bad because you can still get pretty good AC with a little bit less dexterity, and super high dexterity isn't quite as useful for melee characters because it's mainly to give yourself bonuses to ranged weapon attacks, and for melee attacks you mainly want strength. Charisma penalty, that's not too bad, but it would be nice if it didn't do that, because if you want to be like a face of the party and a fighter, then -2 charisma kind of hurts that. I don't know why some of the penalties are the way that they are, like -2 charisma. I mean, I met some pretty good personality dwarves as far as fantasy realms go, but that's just the way that these old rules were. So, and then you get some thieving abilities here as well, which they get some pretty favorable thief treatment despite the fact that they have -1 dexterity. So you could make a pretty interesting fighter-thief multi-class combination with them. But mainly they're frontline fighters, and they also get access to a special class. I'm just going to show it off here. They get access to a special subclass called the Dwarven Defender. And the Dwarven Defender is basically the tankiest class in the entire game. They get, basically they get very high hit die per level to gain hit points. So fighters usually only get a D10 hit die, which is like a maximum of 10 hit points per level. Then you add your Constitution modifier to that. And Dwarven Defenders get an extra 2 hit points maximum per level. So at the beginning stages of the game, it's not a big difference, but once you get a couple levels in, you'll start to notice a difference very much. And then they get Defensive Stance, which is like a very, very tanky ability, which gives you a lot of damage resistance, even beefier saving throws, and the movement rate penalty isn't even that bad because if you're fighting up front, you're not going to be moving around that much, and you're not going to really notice it. So, and you get it from level 1. So you are going to be a tanky character. It's actually a pretty good character for a new player, so if you can't decide what to play, go with a Dwarven Defender because you're going to be a melee character who's very tanky. You take a lot of hits and you dish out hits. There are some disadvantages. Obviously, you can only be a dwarf as a Dwarven Defender. And you can only really use 2 weapons all that well, but axes and warhammers are pretty good weapons, so you're not really losing out there. And you're not going to be able to use other weapons or ranged weapons all that well compared to other fighters. So if you want to be a melee guy, Dwarven Defenders, they do pretty good if you're a new player. So I'd say if you want a starting point, you can kind of go with that if you want to. And then you get Halflings as the next race, which also, similar to Dwarves, they get the shorty saving throw bonuses, which is kind of what these short races get with Gnomes, Halflings, and Dwarfs. So they also get some saving throw bonuses here. They do not get a bonus to Constitution, which kind of sucks, but, you know, it happens. They get a Thaco bonus with slings, and slings are not really a great weapon, but, I mean, it's a bonus nonetheless, so if you're playing a certain kind of class, or if you just like using slings and smacking people in the face with rocks, then hey, you get a good bonus there. They also get a lot of good bonuses to their thieving skills, and the +1 dexterity means that combined with the good thieving skill bonuses, they make for very good thieves. And you can also probably make a decent fighter thief with them if you wanted to, though the penalty to strength is really bad, because you really need strength to be able to do anything in melee, or at least to do more in melee. It's also used for being able to use certain kinds of equipment. So if you aren't able to get super high strength, then some equipment might be locked out, but only certain pieces of equipment. It just depends. The penalty to wisdom is also kind of bad because, well, I'll just show you here. They can be clerics, but you wouldn't ever want to be a cleric, because if you get a penalty to wisdom, then the only thing you gain out of it is flavor of being a halfling. And in these games, I mean, flavor is nice and all, but it's much better to have flavor in tabletop than in video game form. You're better off just being a different race and just kind of flavoring them in your own way as far as backstory. Gnomes. Gnomes are, again, another shorty race, and they get some saving throw bonuses to some things. Not against everything. They don't get the paralysis, poison, and death saving throw bonus, but they get bonus to saving throws versus spell, which is pretty nice. And then provision, which doesn't really do anything, but it's there. And then you have some also pretty good thieving skill treatment, +1 to intelligence, which is the only race that gets an intelligence bonus. So they make prime mages and multi-class mages, because as a gnome, they are the only race that can do multi-classes with a specialist mage, and a specialist mage is basically a subclass of mage. And so specialist mage basically means you get extra spells per, like an extra spell per each level of spells, like you get one extra prepared spell that you can cast each day for each level of spells. So you get one extra first level spell you can cast, and one extra second level spell you can cast, and etc. But you have an opposition school, which in this case for illusionist would be necromancy, which means that you can't cast spells from the necromancy school, but you can get the extra spells per level, which can help out in the long run a lot, because there's only certain spells that you might use anyway. You can kind of get around missing out on certain spell schools. So illusionists, specifically the illusionist multi-classes here, can be very good options because you can get extra spells. And fighter illusionist, fighter mages are already a strong combination, but if you can be an illusionist along with that, then it makes it even stronger. So that's a very, very potent multi-class, and starting off with 19 intelligence makes it even better for all those mage classes. Then finally you have the Half-Orc. And so Half-Orcs, they're simple, you know, they're kind of like they are in 5th edition a bit, where they are mainly frontline warriors. And their stats kind of reflect that. They get +1 to strength and constitution. They are the only race that gets a strength bonus, which means that they can start off with 19 strength. This means super duper amounts of damage. There's a big difference between an 18 strength and 19 strength. 19 strength is very, very powerful, so for that reason, if you're going to be a Half-Orc, then you're going to want to be either a fighter or a fighter cleric in a lot of cases. They can also be a pretty good fighter thief, depending on what you want to do with them. But fighter cleric or fighter, they make very strong options for that, because they get such high strength that they can do so much damage in melee. They are just so damn good. But they don't get any other bonuses, which I guess is fine. The intelligence penalty doesn't really affect them because they can't be mages anyway. So that's just more of a flavor thing. It doesn't really affect anything all that much. But yeah, so they're very good at melee. My particular character that I'm going to be playing for this Let's Play is going to be a human. And they are going to be a Swashbuckler thief, which is a subclass of thief. They basically get some bonuses to melee combat as they level up, and a +1 bonus to armor class at the start of the game. So that's a very nice bonus, and they can get some extra skill points into their weapon and fighting style here. So mainly thieves, they can usually only get 1 point, or like 1 skill point into a weapon or a fighting style. But in this case they can get 2 slots in weapons for melee weapon options, and they can also get 3 slots into 2 weapon fighting. So they can go ahead and dual wield pretty well once you get the weapon skills going up in there. So it'll be a while before I'm able to get 3 slots into 2 weapon fighting for my character, but once they come online, they're going to be very, very strong and dual wielding a lot. There are other sorts of classes in here. So as far as like the different options that you have here, you have usually you're just your standard fighter, but there's also subclasses here which can make them more interesting. The Barbarian originally was its own sort of class, but then eventually Beamdog patched it to be just a fighter subclass to make it simpler to for the programming and for the abilities and such. But you have these different subclasses here with advantages and disadvantages of using them compared to just a plain fighter, which are still strong in their own right, and they can still be a very strong kind of character. And then Arcane Archer is added in via mods. So it's something that I modded into the game. The description, I think, could use a little bit of work, but it's still an interesting class. You also have Berserkers, which are basically frontline warriors that can do a rage sort of ability. which is more of like berserking, I think is what it's technically supposed to be called. Because a Barbarian can also rage, but the rage that they get is different from the Berserker. So Berserker berserks and they gain many sort of status condition like immunities here, which are very helpful throughout the game, especially into the later stages and later levels. And then a +2 bonus to attack and damage rolls, so it allows you to go ahead and do a good deal of damage and gain extra offensive bonuses. The disadvantages are that you cannot really do anything with ranged weapons, so you're not really going to be doing anything from range. This is a purely sort of melee character that you'd be going with. And after berserking, you have sort of a temporary sort of penalty here. So you have to kind of be wise about when you decide to use your berserking rage. And then Wizard Slayer. Wizard Slayer is probably arguably the worst subclass in this game. I recommend that you do not go with it. The biggest problem that I tend to have with the Wizard Slayer is simply that you're not really going to be doing much mage slaying, at least not for a very long time. And you get so many disadvantages. You may not use magic items apart from weapons and armor, so you don't get to take advantage of lots of really cool magical equipment, which means that you miss out on some of the really good portions of the game, which is gaining cool stuff and finding loot out in the wilderness, and from looting dungeons and doing whatever the heck else you might do in a fantasy realm. So personally, I don't like the idea of missing out on portions of the game that way, because getting magic equipment is pretty cool, and 1% magic resistance per level, as you can imagine, that's not going to really do you any good until you get into the higher levels. So at level 10 you have 10% magic resistance, which is just basically what that means is it's your chance of resisting a spell or a spell kind of effect. So 10% resistance is like 1 out of 10 times you might resist something once you're level 10. But that's not even very good compared to what other classes can do in terms of like using spells or using other sorts of abilities, like being an archer that can shoot someone and interrupt their spell casting, for example. Now, granted, a Wizard Slayer can do that very well if they were using ranged weapons, but since you don't really get to use much of the magic equipment, it kind of makes it harder to be a better archer than other people. And they're just not fun to play. They don't really get any good advantages, and they aren't even very good until the super high levels where their magic resistance actually means something. And you're only good against mages, so against other sorts of enemies you're not going to be quite as good. And so yeah, I just want to play something that's fun, and Wizard Slayer just isn't fun. Now if the magic resistance were altered to be higher, and maybe if they got some other advantage, it would be interesting, but it's as is, it's just not a good class and wouldn't be really fun. Kensai is a very interesting sort of class. They aren't generally, because of their disadvantages in terms of not being able to wear certain kinds of equipment, they are considered very, very, specialized. Since they're mainly melee, since they cannot use missile weapons. So they're purely melee, but they can't wear any armor or wear gauntlets or bracers. So they don't get defensive bonuses from equipment as much, but they do make for very, very good dual class characters. If you can play as a human, then you can dual class a Kensai into another class that mitigates the fact that they can't wear armor or do other things like that. So you can be a very powerful melee character in the long run if you're a dual class as a Kensai. Like a Kensai Mage can be super good because they get spells that take the place of armor, for example. They get spells that take the place of not being able to use missile weapons, so they can do something at range with like fireballs or whatever. And then they can't wear gauntlets or bracers, but since they gain spell protections, again, that takes the place of not being able to wear armor or use protective equipment. So it's a very, very potent combination if you dual class to Mage or Thief even. Thief can also be interesting because you can still do thieving stuff and get access to some very good abilities. As a single class though, even though they're very strong offensively with all these like damage bonuses and the Kai ability, not being able to use armor is kind of a death sentence in the long run. They get noticeably better as they get to higher levels, and you might be able to have spellcasters cast a protection spell on them, or you can use potions, but it's a very tricky class to play if just for a single class. But very interesting nonetheless if you want to try playing a human and doing the dual class thing. Barbarian, kind of similar to the Berserker up there, but they are, again, more specialized, kind of similar to the Kensai. They can't exactly wear the heaviest armor like plate, but splint mail is decent, but not quite as good for a little while. It just depends on what kind of special items that you find to kind of gear them up compared to plate mail. You cannot exceed specialization, which is basically 2 slots into a weapon. And so you can get up to 5 slots with each weapon normally as a fighter, but some other classes can only get specialization, which is 2 slots. And then some other classes like the thieves, clerics, and mages and stuff can only get 1 slot. So 1 slot basically means that you avoid penalties, and anything above 1 slot means that you get extra special bonuses to what you do with your weapons. So they trade off getting the extra slots into weapons for faster movement, immunity to backstab, and being able to use a different sort of rage kind of ability. So gaining a bonus of strength and constitution is very good. Strength will just help you do lots of melee damage and give you some really good flat bonuses that usually the advanced kind of specialization in weapons would usually give you, as far as like higher skill levels. So it's kind of like a temporary boost to go ahead and make you as good as normal fighters for the most part for a short amount of time, as well as getting the sort of temporary immunities to some pretty nasty effects here. Charm, hold, and fear, very, obviously they're very nasty for anyone who's ever played tabletop in any edition. Those can be pretty nasty if they end up affecting you. And then confusion and Maze, Stun, and Confusion are pretty bad as well, and those are kind of self-explanatory. They just totally screw up combat for you. So then 11th level and higher, you get some extra resistance to damage here. So that's kind of similar to the damage resistance that Barbarians get in 5th edition D&D. But it's not quite as potent because resistance halves the damage, whereas this is 10% resistance at 11th level. But the good thing about it is that you don't have to be raging to gain the damage resistance in this edition, or with these rules. So it's a constant bonus, and they get a really high hit die, kind of like the Dwarven Defender does. The only difference is that unless you play as a Half-Orc or another Dwarf, you're not going to have as many hit points of the Constitution going on there. And Arcane Archer, the one that I have installed through the mods, is sort of similar to the 5th edition Arcane Archer, except it's a little bit better in some ways because they get some flat bonuses here, kind of similar to a different subclass in this game, which I'll get to a bit later. And so you can kind of see that they get some interesting abilities here. I'm not going to go through all of them word for word, but it's basically some extra ranged abilities and some extra defensive bonuses that can help you out against other enemies that try and shoot at you, basically. And then you get some special arrow abilities, kind of similar to how the 5th edition Arcane Archer gets some arrow abilities, except you get to use these things a lot more often than in 5th edition. And so I'll just scroll down through that, and as you get to higher levels you get some more powerful arrow options here. And disadvantages: lower hit die. You get a penalty whenever you're trying to attack with melee weapons. You can't be too many races, but these are the races that you would usually want to be with an Arcane Archer, like an Elf. An Elf Arcane Archer is a pretty good idea. And then you can't really do anything with something other than longbows and shortbows, which again makes the Elf a prime candidate because they get a Thaco bonus of bows. And so you can't really do as much in melee, and you can't wear very heavy armor. In my testing, you can't even wear chainmail. I think it's studded leather is the most that you can wear. But even then, I mean, you're not going to be worrying as much about armor class if you're sticking back and shooting people. So that's another thing. And the hit die, you just get lower hit points per level. It's not the biggest deal in the world for an archer because you're not going to be up in the front doing things that way. Ranger is kind of a specialized form of fighter here, and they get some different abilities here, and they get free 2 slots into weapon fighting. So that makes them a decent option for like a multi-class character that wants to play a Ranger Cleric, which is a multi-class option. So if you want to dual wield as something that's not a fighter cleric, you're just being a Ranger Cleric instead, then this can be a decent option for the free 2 weapon fighting. But they do have more restrictions as far as single class goes, because you get some very niche abilities here that aren't always going to be useful. And you get a racial enemy, which is only one kind of enemy, which in some situations can be nice, but it's not always going to be nice, because it only applies to one kind of enemy. So I'd rather have abilities that help me against all enemies against only one kind, is kind of what I'm getting at. Now, while the single-class base Ranger isn't really all that strong as compared to other classes, they're still a decent class as far as if you want to be a melee character or an archer, because you get a subclass here called the Archer Kit. So this is a very strong kit. It's slightly different in my game that I'm playing, because I'm playing with the improved Archer Kit mod, which gives them some more appropriate bonuses and penalties, and makes them more viable for in the second game, where things are a lot different for archery compared to this game, where archery is super strong. So the base Archer Kit is already pretty strong at range, and so in the first game they'll be fine. In the second game, not quite as much, which is why I'm using the improved Archer Kit mod. So that way in the second game things will be a bit more even keel as far as their effectiveness, and it kind of paces things a little bit better. So they get +1 to hit and damage rolls with missile weapons every 3 levels, and that adds up very quickly and makes it just super easy to be able to hit people, especially if you play an elf archer. You get 19 dexterity to start with, which is like the maximum you can start with the +1 dexterity bonus. And then you get the extra to hit here, which means that as you level up, it just keeps going up and up and up, and it's just... you can do so much just by yourself as an Archer Kit. They're super strong once you start getting the extra skill points into your longbows or short bows or stuff. They also get some shot abilities here, and so it's a very, very interesting kind of blend of being... you're not really an arcane archer, you're just kind of a ranger kind of archer. So things are going to be working like that through the game. And so, as you get to the higher levels, obviously, you'll encounter enemies that have to be hit by certain kinds of ammunition. So you need magical ammunition in this edition to be able to deal damage to certain kinds of enemies. So that's one thing you have to worry about later on as you get into later levels. But the shot abilities can be pretty good here. Rooting shot can entangle people and make them unable to move. So that's very good if you're an archer, so you can entangle people, run away, then keep shooting at them while they can't get to you. Power shot gives you knockback. This probably isn't a very powerful shot option in my opinion, but in some cases it might be useful if you are wanting to go ahead and keep them off the back of a mage. And if you have like a mage in the party, for example. You have explosive shot, which is very, very good for crowd control kind of area of effect damage, kind of similar to... it's like a poor man's fireball, but the fact that you can do it with a ranged attack is very, very good, and you're already so good at ranged attacks that this is just enhances your damage output. And then blessed ammunition just helps you out if you're unable to find magical ammunition through the game. Then you can just create blessed ammunition, so that way you have an option at least to hit certain enemies that require magical weapons to hit. In 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, you would only need a flat magical weapon to be able to damage any kind of enemy, even the powerful enemies. But in this game, you might need at the higher levels, you might need a super powerful enchantment on your weapon to be able to hit them, like a +3 enchantment to hit them. That's just to be able to hit them. And so, let's say you have a +1 weapon, but you're against an enemy that requires a +2 weapon just to be able to hit them, then you're kind of out of luck. So this goes for both melee weapons and for ammunition. So you have to kind of keep that in mind as you get more into the sequel. In the first game, it's not a big issue because you might find enough stuff to go around to where you don't have to worry too much about this. But the second game, I believe that's going to be a much bigger issue to worry about. They get a Constitution penalty, which sucks if you're an elf archer because they already have a Constitution penalty, so it stacks with this one. But it's still a very good class, even though you can't wear metal armor either. But there are ways around that with non-metal armors that are very strong. At least in my experience anyway. And studded leather is still a decent kind of armor to be able to wear as well, if you're just going to be an archer. And you can't use melee weapons very well. You still get the free 2-weapon fighting slots from being a ranger. So, I mean, if someone comes at you in melee, you can still dual wield weapons and do decent damage if you have good strength. But generally, you're going to be going with the bows, usually, are what you're going to be going with. Stalker Ranger is kind of like an interesting blend between a fighter and a thief. They're not quite as strong, though, as other kinds of classes, because their backstab multiplier is not as good as what a thief would be able to do. And they're not going to be as good at stealth as a thief might usually be, or they can't do the same kind of secondary things like opening locks or disarming traps, which are pretty important, or being able to do other things like set traps if you really want to try that. They do get some interesting spells later on, which will only be relevant for the sequel game, since the first game you're not going to get to this high of level yet. But they do get some pretty good spells. Haste is a pretty good spell to get. It gives you more attacks and things like that. Protection from normal missiles can be pretty good if you're an archer, and minor spell deflection can be pretty decent. The big problem is that, well, when you're restricted to studded leather and you can't wear heavier armor, that means that you're not going to be quite as good in melee. So you have to kind of keep that in mind right there. Beastmaster Ranger, not quite as good as most other classes go because, well, let's just look at the disadvantages here. You can't really use very many weapons. Metal weapons means that you lose out on a lot of good weapons. Quarterstaves are a decent weapon in melee, but the fact that you can't wear any armor heavier than studded leather means that you're not very good in melee, and you don't really get any truly good abilities in exchange. You're better off just being a regular ranger, I think. But, I mean, if you like the flavor of being good with animals and getting fine familiar and being able to summon animals to fight for you and stuff, I mean, yeah, it's a decent ability, but it's not worth it if you want to be a ranger. You can just be any kind of spellcaster and get these kind of abilities instead. At least in my opinion, the trade-offs make them a pretty poor class. Then we have Paladins, which are universally considered a very good class. They get all the same sort of equipment that a fighter can wear. They only get specialization and weapons, kind of similar to the Barbarian fighter and the Ranger. So they can't get the 5 sort of slots and a weapon and stuff, but they can still use all the really good equipment. They still get access to all the fighting styles and stuff like that. And they get access to Lay on Hands, which is a pretty good healing ability, and it's kind of a, you can use it in a pinch and you don't have to worry about it getting interrupted like a healing spell could. And then Protection from Evil can occasionally be pretty useful against some kinds of enemies. Turn Undead, not very useful in these games from my experience, but you get that if you really want to try it. And at higher levels you can cast some clerical kind of spells. And then you get a +2 bonus to all saving throws, which is a very good bonus. And then they get the same amount of hit points as a fighter does. Now a fighter will level up a bit faster than Paladin, so as time goes on, the fighter might have more hit points than a Paladin will in the long run, but Paladin gets some interesting secondary abilities, and they get some very, very good kit options here for their subclasses. Now, in general, Paladins are kind of known as being like holy warriors and things like that, and Well, 2nd edition and Baldur's Gate are really no exception to that. In the original game, you couldn't be any of the Paladin kits or whatever, but in the second game you could, and so they've been included into the base game, and this is the same for all of the classes. Originally, you couldn't be any subclass in the original Baldur's Gate back in 1998 when it first came out, and the Enhanced Edition added in the class kits. The only subclasses that you could be in the original game were the Specialist Mage kits. But here we have the Cavalier. Cavalier is probably one of my personal favorite subclasses in this entire series. It is very, very good against lots of people because they have at-will remove fear, essentially. So once per day per level means that basically once you get to 5th level or so, you have it at will, essentially, of how many times you can use it. So whenever a party member ends up getting affected by some kind of fear effect, not a reference to the video game fear effect, but more of a spell or something like that, then remove fear basically gets your party back into the fight at will. So that makes these guys very strong as like a party leader type. They get your party members back into the fight, and so it's a very, very good all-around ability. Another good thing about them is that they also get native immunity to fear themselves and immunity to charm. So they are never going to be put out of the fight, and morale failure is kind of like whenever your hit points get low, you have like morale checks and stuff like that to see if you try and retreat. I don't really like morale failure as a mechanic. I think that should be role-played, but in games you have to program mechanics a certain way, and it's just the way that they work. But the good thing is that this also goes for enemies, so sometimes they'll try and run away as well, and that makes them easier to pick off. And immunity to poison is also quite good. It means that, you know, someone has like a poisoned weapon, for example, they're not going to be able to hurt you with the poison. So immunity to all of these things is super, super good. And then you get a bit of resistance to fire, which is a common damage type. And acid, it's not too common, but there are some spells that might use that kind of damage. So all of the resistances and immunities that they get are quite good. This bonus it won't really help out a lot in the first game, but obviously these kinds of creatures are the kinds of creatures that you might encounter more at higher levels of play. So this is something that would probably come more into play for the sequel game. Now, you're not able to use any missile weapons at all, but honestly, if you're a Cavalier, why would you want to? Like, I don't know, like, my idea of a knight in shining armor, they're not going to be using a bow or a crossbow. So you're just going to go in there and get in there and start whacking people to hell, basically. I ban you to hell, you evil spirits. Psh, you know. But this is one of my personal favorite subclasses, and I was thinking about playing one for this playthrough, but I wanted to try something different that I hadn't tried before, and that might be very interesting to try and give us something in the party that we might not normally have. So, the Inquisitor Paladin, also regarded as another very, very good Paladin subclass, arguably, in other people's eyes, it's generally considered one of the strongest subclasses as well. Paladins have very good subclass kits, meaning that you're usually better off playing a kit than the regular Paladin. So play one of these if you want to play a Paladin, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many others as well. Inquisitor is very strong because they get Dispel Magic as a native ability. And so the fact that they can go ahead and cast it at double the Inquisitor's character level means that they're very good at dispelling magic protections that spellcasters will cast on themselves and make it harder for your fighters and stuff like that to be able to hit them. So if you make it easier for all of your fighting type of characters to hit the enemies, then you're basically making it easier to just go ahead and kill everybody before they can really do much in combat. So this is a very powerful debuff ability against spellcasters, and True Sight can also be pretty good, like against like illusion magic and things like that. So like in 5th edition as well, a common defensive spell could be something like Mirror Image, for example. But if you have something like True Sight, you can see through things like illusions and things like that, or invisibility, etc. So this is a very powerful sort of ability, and it's a higher level spell for spellcasters to have. So having that as a native ability is also quite good. and being immune to hold and charm, which these are both very good immunities to have. Immunity to charm means that you will not very often be taken out of the fight, and if you happen to have a Paladin and an Inquisitor in the same party, or a Cavalier and an Inquisitor in the same party, like for a multiplayer playthrough like what I'm doing, then having both of these means that you are going to have a very strong front line, and they are not going to be going anywhere against spellcasters that try and cast spells on them to get them to run away or to charm them or things like that. They do have some disadvantages. They don't really get to cast spells as far as the Cleric stuff at the higher levels, but getting to spell Magic and True Sight as powerful debuff abilities kind of makes up for not getting any of these. Turn Undead is not very useful anyway, and I never really use it, especially in a Paladin, so you don't really lose out on that. Lay on Hands kind of sucks to lose that because it's a pretty good heal. But these are very strong characters to have. Undead Hunter is very self-explanatory. They get bonuses to dealing with undead creatures. So, I mean, they're kind of common and they're kind of not. It just depends on the situation. It's very situational. When you fight undead, obviously they're going to be very good, and these immunities are pretty good at higher levels. But they're more thematic than they are mechanical, because you can probably be a pretty good undead hunter as a different class that can do it just the way that an undead hunter could do. But I mean, they're still really good. They can't use Lay on Hands, which is a nice ability to have. So if you want to be an undead hunter, and you could just be a Cavalier instead with all these immunities and stuff, and still get some pretty good bonuses and still get to use Lay on Hands and stuff like that. But they're still pretty good. I still call them a really good class, comparable to just playing a fighter. Then you get the Blackguard, which is sort of what you would call the anti-Paladin. They are the sort of evil Paladin subclass in this game. So if you want to be an evil fighter, this is a pretty good option. You get some decent immunities here. And you can still turn undead, but you get some different abilities instead of Lay on Hands. You could absorb health, which is sort of self-beneficial kind of ability to drain hit points and give yourself hit points. Then you get poison weapon, which is kind of similar to a rogue or a thief that poisons a weapon and does extra damage and can do a pretty good job of interrupting mages casting spells because it deals damage each round, which gives them basically every time they take damage it will have a pretty good chance of interrupting the spell when that happens. Poisoning your weapon can also be pretty good as far as just giving yourself a little bit of extra damage as well. You also get Aura of Despair, which is basically sort of like a debuff aura against enemies. So whereas you might have, say, you have bards in this game which can use like bard songs that can benefit allies, this is kind of an opposite of bard song, where instead you impose penalties to your enemies, which can be pretty decent, and it gets pretty good at higher levels as well. But yeah, basically as far as paladins go, Blackguard's pretty damn good, and they're pretty good for an evil party to be kind of an evil kind of party leader, or a lawful evil kind of, you know, conniving, very strong-willed person, so to speak. Obviously they're restricted to evil. You don't get detect evil, and not getting protection from evil kind of sucks because you're going to be fighting lots of people that are evil like you for the most part. As far as like, you know, like whenever you fight monsters, usually their alignment's going to be evil, and this is the case. And you know, like if you play like 5th edition D&D as tabletop goes, it's easy to assume that lots of monsters that you fight are going to be of evil alignment, and they're not going to be of like good alignment. So protection from evil tends to be pretty good because it affects a good array of enemies that it protects you from. And not getting Lay on Hands, you kind of get the other ability up here for Absorb Health that kind of replaces Lay on Hands. So not getting Lay on Hands, I mean, you get a replacement for it, so it's kind of like a trade instead of losing it outright. So yeah, it's a very good kit for an evil character. One thing you will notice is that paladins, they do not get to do like divine smiting and things like that, so some people might be disappointed that you do not get to do the Nova damage Divine Smite like you can in 5th edition. And also you cannot do any multi-classing or dual classing as a Paladin. So as a Paladin, you either go straight Paladin or nothing. That's basically how it works with Paladin, and in the base game, you can only play Paladin as a human. But you can use like a character file editing software called EEKeeper to go ahead and play a Paladin as a different race if you really want to. I mean, I don't think that it would necessarily be unbalanced to just play as a different race, like, say, I don't know, a Dwarven Paladin. I mean, that's pretty common in other kinds of games out there. Like, you'd expect there to be Dwarven Paladins or some Elf Paladins or some half-elf Paladins out there and things like that, like are in 5th edition. But in this game, you're going to have to use like a save editor kind of software to do that, but I don't mind if people do that, because that's just a flavor thing. Then we move on to Clerics, and Clerics are, well, what you'd expect. They're kind of holy men, kind of similar to Paladins, but they're not quite as melee-oriented, but they can still use a lot of armor and all that good stuff. They can't use bladed weapons, so they have to use the blunt options in the old rules. But blunt options are still pretty good for melee weapons. Slings are their only ranged option, so unless you are able to get like a throwing warhammer of some kind, so I'm not sure when you would get those, but I know that those are a thing to my knowledge, but I'm not sure when you get them necessarily. But yeah, Clerics are generally still full spellcasters that can just kind of wear armor and occasionally get into melee and whack people over the head and bash their face in. They can learn fighting styles, but only 1 point in it, so as far as fighting styles go, you're not usually going to invest too much into that, but you can if you want to. And they can get 1 slot in any weapon, so they don't get any particular big bonuses, but they don't really have too many restrictions unless it's just for weapons, basically. They get to cast free spells, obviously, and they get a couple of different kits here. Some of these kits were added in through one of the recent Enhanced Edition patches. I believe that Tyr and Tempus were added in. Basically, once the patches ended up getting some extra subclasses in there, like these priest kits, and also the Shaman class, which is in there. So they get lots of the divine spellcasting, which is kind of standard for Clerics, and so they also get lots of sort of healing, buffing, and support magic. So they can also buff themselves up with some pretty good spells, so they can potentially be decent melee combatants, especially if they are a fighter cleric multiclass, like I mentioned earlier. And then you get some of these different subclasses here, which give you different abilities, and they might have some alignment restrictions on what you can do with them. But you have a Lightning Bolt spell for this one, for an evil cleric. So Lightning Bolt is your sort of standard offensive spell, which a lot of people probably are familiar with at this point. And then Storm Shield gives you some extra defensive bonuses against some different damage types. So that's also very good if you want to be a melee tank character, perhaps. Then you have Priest of Helm, which is more of a sort of either lawful alignment or neutral kind of alignment that you can get here. But you can be a few different alignments in there. So you can be good, evil, or neutral. And you get some pretty good abilities here. True Sight was the ability that the Inquisitor Paladin gets, and this Priest of Helm also gets that, which is a very strong sort of debuff against certain kinds of magical abilities and things like that. Seeking Sword, which is you basically get a sort of sword that gives you extra bonuses. So it's an enchanted sort of weapon, so it can be pretty good if you're a melee fighter person, and so combined with your buffing and defensive magic, you might be able to get into melee similar to a fighter and do some pretty good damage there. The only downside is that you cannot cast spells after you use this ability, so you have to buff yourself up with spells first, then use this ability and wait into melee combat. So it's kind of a disadvantage there. I should mention before I go much further is that you shouldn't really play a base cleric. You should always be a kit, because the only restrictions for the kits are the alignments. And so you're gonna have to pick an alignment anyway, so you might as well be a kit and get these free bonuses. So playing a regular cleric I would not recommend. I just choose a kit of some kind, depending on what deity fits you the most. Oh, I think I kind of forgot for a moment that I should probably explain some of these deities here, so that way you can understand the flavor of them better. Talos is an evil deity who I think is like the god of storms or something like that. I can't quite remember, but I think that's what Talos is, and that's why you get the free lightning bolt and storm shield as your abilities there. Priest of Helm. Helm is the god of protection. And there's a decent amount of paladins, I think, that also worship Helm. So it's a pretty interesting kind of deity. God of Protection can be lots of good aligned and neutral aligned characters might worship that. Lathander is the god of birth and renewal. So they're kind of a good aligned god, and it's kind of like if you're to get a child baptized or something like that in the D&D world, then Lathander might be the kind of deity that you might worship, or that you ask for like a blessing or something like that. Because like whenever you have a child, then it's like Lathander, birth and renewal. It's kind of a self-explanatory sort of god there. Tyr is the god of justice, and it's like a lawful good god where lots of paladins may end up worshipping Tyr or a similar sort of deity like that. And it's a very lawful good in some senses. They can kind of either be very strict, or they have a certain kind of code that they follow, kind of similar to being a worshipper of Tyr. So you'd have a certain kind of code that you would follow to inflict, or not to inflict, but to do justice onto the world and to people who wrong others and things of that nature. So it's something that maybe not everyone would agree with, but generally good-natured people tend to follow Tyr, just more restrictive, I guess. And then Tempus is the god of war, I believe. And so Tempus is just general, war, fighting, just generally things like that. A variety of people would probably worship Tempus if they are just into fighting a lot and they don't really care who they're fighting, or if they just want to be around other people that love a good fight, then they might worship Tempus. And while there will be some mention of some other deities in the game, these are just the options that you get as a cleric as far as picking your subclass. So, yeah, this is kind of this is just how it goes in the older editions and the way that you pick your characters. Alright then, and now we're finally on to the Priest of Lathander. So they get to hold undead. Not exactly a great ability, but I mean, it's a free ability, so you might be able to make use of that. Boon of Lathander, though, is where it's at for the Priest of Lathander. It basically gives you extra bonuses to your attack and damage rolls and to other things, and it gives you an extra attack per round. So it kind of gives you bonuses similar to having weapon specialization for a temporary amount of time. And it makes you immune to level drain, which early on you're not going to really deal with that all that much. It's more of a thing at the higher levels, essentially, for like high tier enemies. But it's a good melee buff, so it makes you pretty good in melee, and it's restricted to mainly good aligned characters. So if you're going to be a good aligned character worshipping a good aligned god, Lathander is a pretty decent option there. Now we're on to Tyr, which is how I pronounce it. It could be pronounced differently officially, but that's just how I pronounce it, and it just sounds better to me. Tyr, as I said before, is sort of like the god of law, justice and everything like that. And so lots of lawful good people will tend to worship Tyr. And so they get Exaltation. So Exaltation just is basically a nice little buff and protection kind of spell. You get Divine Favor, and Divine Favor is a spell in 5th edition, but in this one it's kind of like a flat bonus kind of spell. So this is, it it kind of scales as you level. Divine Favor in 5th edition D&D is just sort of a flat bonus for the most part, and it's a first level spell, so it's not going to be uber powerful. But this ability kind of scales as you level up, so when you get to the higher levels, you can potentially do some pretty decent melee stuff there. And you have the alignment restrictions, mainly lawful characters and also neutral good. So, for the most part, if you want to play a lawful good goody two-shoes character, Tyr could be a pretty decent option for you. Lastly, we get to the Priests of Tempus. So Tempus, Lord of Battles, and such. So it's kind of like a war sort of domain kind of deity here. And they can be found on various different sides of conflict. And so like I said, it's anyone who likes a good fight for the most part. And, you know, winning wars and that kind of thing, wishing for good favor, good luck, and protection, and things like that. You get Holy Power once per day. So, Holy Power, I believe, is a spell, and it's a pretty good spell. It's kind of like a buffing kind of spell to make yourself much more potent in melee combat. Chaos Battle. So, it's a sort of aura type of spell, and it lasts for 1 turn, and 1 turn, I don't remember exactly how long that is, but I think it's somewhere around 10 rounds. That's just my guesstimation. I kind of forget how long that is in 2nd edition terms, but it lasts for a decent amount of time, and it can usually last for an entire combat for the most part. But yeah, it basically gives random bonuses and penalties, I think. And then the alignment restrictions are mainly, it's more of a neutral kind of god, but you can also be certain chaotic alignments to be a god of, to worship the god of war and to try and win their favor through combat. Alright, and so that's it for all the Cleric subclasses. Then we have Druids, and Druids are a bit of a tough beast to get a hold of in this edition. They have lots of equipment restrictions, and they also can't learn too much in the way of weapons as well. And they also have some pretty strict dual classing requirements, so you're not often going to find someone dual classing into a Druid because you have to have a high charisma there. Obviously, only getting to wear non-metallic armor means that, for the most part, you're not going to really find them much in melee, if at all. They're basically just going to be a full spellcaster, kind of similar to a Cleric, but they're going to be hanging back a lot more with sort of secondary kinds of spells and more offensive-oriented magic compared to a Cleric. But they also get some healing spells as well to kind of heal the party up a little bit if they need it. They also get some shape-shifting abilities, which can be somewhat wonky in the older editions, or at least the Baldur's Gate video game kind of form. You know, I like more of a straight-up character than shape-shifting into other stuff, but that's just me. Obviously, later on in the game, you can sort of get into some extra shape-shifting forms rather than just these things right here. So, later on, you can get some pretty interesting shape-shifting going on, depending also on your subclass as well for that, because you have a couple of subclasses here. But Druidic spells have some good spells in there, but you're not going to be sifting into melee like you could with Cleric or Mage spells, perhaps. And then you also get some defensive bonuses here. I mean, they need a poison, but not for a long time, so you're not really able to count on that for a long time. And then you get resistances at the super high levels, and this is all basically sequel game stuff here. So in the first game, you're not going to get any of this. So just kind of be warned, if you want to play the first game as a Druid, or a Fighter Druid, you're not going to be getting this stuff until the second game, and not until a good deal as far as levels go. One thing to note about Druids is that they probably have the most strict alignment restriction in true neutral. Paladins, I forgot to mention earlier, they are restricted to lawful good in these games unless you're a Blackguard, which is like an evil Paladin. So you can obviously use save game editor software to edit a character file and give yourself whatever alignment that you want. So if you don't want to play with these really strict alignment restrictions, you can download the EEKeeper save game editor software and edit your character file to play a different alignment that you're more fond of. Totemic Druid. So this is more of a summoning based kind of Druid subclass, and they identify with a particular animal. So it's kind of like, if you're familiar with 5th edition D&D, you might think of the Totemic, or not the Totem Warrior Barbarian subclass, where you identify with a particular spirit animal and you like carry a totem around and something like that. So you can summon spirit animals, so it's kind of like a summoning ability that you get for free. And then you can't shapeshift, which isn't too bad of a trade-off. Summoning abilities are decent if you have a melee heavy party, or if you just want these guys to be like kind of like sword sponges when people are going in trying to attack you. Instead they attack your summon animals, which allows everyone else to do things offensively. Not exactly too great, but I mean, if you like animals and stuff like that, and you wanted to summon friendly animals, be like, go my animals, help, then this might be the class for you if you like that kind of flavor and some extra druid spells packed in there. Then you have the Shapeshifter here, and then they're more of a, well, as it says here, they've become willingly infected with lycanthropy, which means that they can turn into a werewolf kind of whenever they feel like it. But they have more control over it, so they don't randomly turn into it. But you have a werewolf form that you can use for your shapeshifting. You don't get other shapeshifting options because you're more focused on this one form with your werewolf form. And then you don't get to wear armor, which means that when you're not in your werewolf form, you are very vulnerable. So I'm not sure if I would recommend this class all that much, just because shapeshifting, again, is more of a sporadic ability, and not being able to wear armor means that you're very vulnerable when you aren't shapeshifting. And werewolves can be decent enough, but they're not quite as good as enemies that you might encounter. So you're better off kind of playing with a straight up kind of fighter where you get your abilities all the time instead of shapeshifting for them. That's just my personal opinion, obviously, and I like things that, you know, they kind of help you a lot more than just situational or sporadic abilities, so to speak. But you can still be one, and you can still try and make it work, and you still get all of your druid spellcasting and all that without restrictions. So if you want to play as a sort of werewolf shapeshifter kind of person, then this might be the class for you if you really want to try that. Not recommended for newcomers, but once you're familiar with the game, you can try it out if you like the flavor of it. Then for the last druid subclass, we have the Avenger, which is sort of like a dedicated kind of spellcaster class, which is kind of like a mix of druidic magic and mage magic. So you get some extra shape-shifting forms here, so you can do some extra stuff in melee or get some different resistances based on what kind of shape-shifting form that you have. Then you end up having more shape-shifting, and again, some of these things you don't really get into the sequel. Sometimes it mentions it here in the description, and sometimes it doesn't. But the main thing that they get are extra arcane spells, which usually only mages get these, but the Avenger gets some extra options here. So you get some pretty decent spells here that you can use, whether for yourself or for raining chaos on the battlefield. Some of these are better for damage, and some of these are for like crowd control and for area of effect damage. Chain lightning, self-explanatory there. Web, kind of self-explanatory. You kind of crowd control and try and hang up enemies and make it easier to go ahead and pick them off. They do have some hefty disadvantages. They cannot wear much in the way of armor. They just get leather. Leather isn't exactly great in this game, but I mean, it's still better than nothing, so you'll have that, but it's a pretty hefty penalty, so you're not going to ever be wading into melee, especially with the fact that you get a penalty through Strength and Constitution. So with this, you're basically delegated to being a full-time spellcaster and occasionally shapeshifting to get around the penalties to your physical stats here, because when you shapeshift, you take on the stats of whatever you're shapeshifting into. So if you shapeshift into a sword spider, for example, you take on the sword spider stats, and you can kind of get around these penalties when you want to for a temporary amount of time, and then when you're not shapeshifting, you're just going to be flinging around spells and druid spells and some of these things right here that you get, which is good. Then we get to the big meat with the mages. Now obviously they're the squishiest class in the game, along with sorcerers here, but they get all the arcane spells. They don't really get much in the way of equipment. They are very limited in what they can do with that. But they get all the really awesome, they get some of the really awesome spell casting. They get some really good multi-classing combinations going on. And they also get all these interesting subclasses. And you can see here that based on what kind of subclass that you choose, you can get some extra saving throw bonuses and saving throw penalties. Or saving throw penalties for people that you cast spells against, which is pretty nice. So yeah, you have your base mage, which is regular old mage. You probably wouldn't want to play a single class mage as just a regular mage. You probably want to pick a subclass of some kind, so that way you get the extra spell per level. And each of these will have an opposition school. So this is Alteration School as the opposition school, and every other subclass has a different opposition school. And you'll also notice here that some of them also have some secondary stats that they have to have a minimum stat in. So Conjurer needs at least some Constitution, Enchanter needs some Charisma, and so this gives them some flavor, but also kind of imposes semi-restrictions for some of these. So like here with Illusionist, so if you have a 16 minimum Dexterity, then that can still obviously be helpful, same with Constitution. So anything that requires a physical stat like Constitution or Dexterity can be a good subclass. And depending on the opposition school, some of these can be better than others. So some schools have some very useful spells in them, and so you don't really want to miss out on opposition schools in some cases. Like Abjuration has lots of defensive magic for you. And then Invocation means that you missed out on lots of the offensive magic, like fireballs and all the really cool stuff that does lots of really damage-dealing spells for a lot of them. But yeah, I would definitely recommend playing as a subclass of some kind. I wouldn't recommend playing an Enchanter, because you don't get the offensive spells, which are the fun ones. But some of these other ones can be interesting options. Illusionist is good. Conjurer is also a pretty good starting school. If you like, flavor or anything else about any of these schools, you can pick what you want, obviously. Then you get Wild Mage, which is a subclass as well, but it's kind of unpredictable with some of these abilities. Your spellcasting can basically go randomly up and down based on just your subclass. So whenever you cast a spell, not only do you have a chance of a Wild Surge happening, which is kind of similar to the Wild Surge table that you can get in 5th edition playing with a Wild Magic Sorcerer, it has randomized effects, where while you do get the additional spell per level, whenever you cast a spell, it essentially is random what the spell casting level ends up being. So like if you're a 5th level mage and you cast like a 1st level spell that scales with your spell casting level, the spell casting level can kind of be randomized, so it can be better or worse. So you don't know what you're always going to be getting with this kind of class. So because of that, I don't recommend it for a first playthrough. If you want to play it later on after you have a good grasp of the game, you could try something like this, but I would probably recommend a different specialist mage that doesn't have the randomization, which means that you kind of have to save your game often and make sure that you don't get screwed over a bit by having a Wild Surge that really is not helpful or gets you killed. Then we move on to the Thieves. And so a Thief is what I'm going to be playing with my character. I'm going to be playing a Swashbuckler Thief as a human, who will eventually dual class to a Mage. But that's just a general idea of what my character will be doing, but I'm going to give a bigger description of what the Thief does. So they have some equipment restrictions here, so they can't wear heavier armor types, but they still get some decent studded leather armor. They don't really get to equip shields other than bucklers, so they get the option of using bucklers, but you're not often going to be using those. It's more of a situational kind of benefit. They get some decent weapon options here for their thief weapons and for being able to backstab with the melee weapons. You only can become proficient in weapon or fighting styles, so there are some fighting styles that can be useful depending on your weapon. For example, you can get a single weapon style for single-handed weapons, or two-handed style for a two-handed weapon like a quarterstaff, which is a decent option depending on what kind of flavor you want for your character. And of course, one of the biggest things about being a thief is that you get thief skills. So each race will usually get some kind of bonus or penalty to a certain thieving abilities, mostly benefits, but the elves get a penalty to open locks, while for most of these other things they end up getting bonuses. So most races will get some kind of bonus to some of these different thief skills. So open locks, kind of self-explanatory, that's kind of like lockpicking and things like that. But it's very, very useful because you're not going to be able to force open every door with your high strength characters. So being able to open up locks with your thief will be very useful. Pickpockets, situational, but sometimes it might be worth getting. The problem with pickpockets is that you have to save scum for it to work, because if you get caught pickpocketing, then you turn like an entire town against you, and that's never good in these games. And pickpockets also requires a small bit of metagaming to know who has potentially useful items without just save scumming trying to pickpocket everyone on the map. Find traps is very, very useful because there's deadly traps. If you come across traps, they're usually going to be very, very nasty to deal with, so you want usually at least one person that has find traps in your party, otherwise you have to tank the traps, which can be kind of deadly in some cases. So you just have to be very careful about traps in this game. It's a pretty important skill. Move silently and hide in shadows are basically your stealth abilities. Back in the earlier editions they kind of had these separate instead of just into one single stealth skill. So you have to kind of put points into these evenly to be able to do stealth. Then you have Detect Illusion, which is basically sort of a skill similar to Find Traps, where instead of finding traps you can try and detect illusions actively. So if someone is like if they have a defensive spell, like with illusion magic up, then you can try and use Detect Illusion to see through the illusion and break through the spell and kind of dispel it in a way. And you might also be able to detect if something is like using an invisibility spell with this, I think. So lots of things from the illusion school of magic you can kind of see through with Detect Illusion. So this isn't usually as useful early on, but later on it can be useful when there's going to be higher level enemies and more enemies that might use this kind of magic. Then for the last one you have Set Traps, which is basically you set traps, and I forget, well, it's actually its own separate skill. It probably should be part of Find Traps, but it's not. But basically you can set traps and you can kind of lure enemies into traps. You have to set traps before combat because you can't set them during combat. So you have to kind of plan ahead with this and try and bait enemies into traps. Sometimes they can be good, but usually I kind of find myself thinking of them as like an afterthought. I don't usually remember to use them. But if you want to try them, then you know they can be potentially pretty good if you can get used to the strategies that you have to employ to use them. Then this is just the base scores that you start off with, no matter what kind of well, it depends on your race, obviously, for your racial bonuses, but this is the base starting percentage that you start off with without putting any points into it at the start. So if you're a human, you'll start with these as your base stats for these different thief skills. Then over here we have the backstabbing, which is basically similar to the sneak attack that thieves end up having in 5th edition D&D. The difference being that backstab has some pretty interesting scaling that goes on here for single hit damage. and it's only for melee attacks, so you have to kind of sneak up on someone by hiding in shadows, or someone casts the invisibility spell on you and you sneak up behind them and then hit them. Something like that. So you catch an enemy unaware and you backstab them for massive amounts of damage. So it's kind of like a single hit, one shot, one kill kind of situation where you try and kill them or heavily damage them with a single attack. And then set snare, that's kind of like the set traps skill right there. So you can set snares and do some interesting damage and effects here. Of course, the downside is that they don't get very much hit die, so they don't get the most hit points per level compared to other characters. Druids and Clerics get more hit points per level, and other classes generally get more. The only classes that get less are the Mages and Sorcerers for the most part. Then you have, for subclasses here, you have Assassin. Assassins, as you can see, are very good at backstabbing. So their backstab multiplier can reach a much higher cap than the other subclasses and the regular thieves, and also multi-class thieves as well. And then the the flat bonus to hit and damage rolls is very nice because they're a melee-oriented class that wants to do backstabbing and stealth and things like that. Then they also get Poison Weapon, which adds a bit of damage for each time they get a hit off, which is nice. And it can also be very useful against mages, since this kind of thing can interrupt mage spellcasting when they take the poison damage. And since the poison damage happens every round for a little while, then that makes it a lot easier to interrupt mage spellcasting with that, so it's very, very good. Disadvantages, less skill points per level. If you're playing a single class thief to be a backstabbing assassin, this isn't too bad of a penalty, because eventually you're going to get your skill points and the skills that you want. But it's a very good class to play if you want to play a single class thief, because the backstab multiplier is very, very good, and you can just deal so much damage for a single hit. You have bounty hunters here. There's not much to say about them. Basically, they're a trap-setting thief. There's nothing that's really too exciting about them. As far as the advantages that you gain, you get some special traps that you can set, but the regular thief also gets like traps that they can set, which do pretty good stuff itself. So if you want to be a trap-setting thief, you don't even really need to play a bounty hunter. You're much better off probably just playing a regular thief for trap setting. So unfortunately, bounty hunter, I can't really recommend it, because it doesn't really give you anything special that a regular thief wouldn't already give you. But, I mean, you're free to try it if you want to, because you like the flavor of it. But mechanically, you're not really going to gain anything out of it compared to just playing a regular thief. Swashbuckler. So this is going to be the class that I am playing. It's a melee-oriented class. They cannot backstab, so that sucks, but you're going to be melee-oriented as far as, on a more consistent basis. You're going to be wading into the fray more as a Swashbuckler, because you get bonuses to armor class and to hit and damage. And you get better weapon skills, and you get the two-weapon fighting style that you can put a good amount of points into. So you can be a dual wielder that's dual wielding like swords or daggers or things like that, which can be very, very good. And unlike in the 5th edition rules, where offhand attacks do not really scale with getting extra attacks, in this game, dual wielding does scale with getting extra attacks, so dual wielding makes for very strong offensive characters. And I am playing with a mod that gives you extra attacks per round, even if you're a non-warrior class and you have specialization. So I felt that's kind of more fair if you're playing with a subclass like Swashbuckler, or maybe if you're playing with a mod that adds in kits, like say a Cleric kit, that you can get 2 points into a weapon with specialization. Basically, as you get more weapon points into your weapon skills, basically it gives you extra bonuses, like to hit and damage, but it also gives you extra attacks per round. But usually if you're a non-warrior class, which is basically fighters, paladins, and rangers, you don't generally get the extra attacks per round, because you're not a warrior. So I'm using a mod that gives every class the specialization bonus of extra attacks per round. So if you have more than one skill point into a weapon, then no matter what class that you are, you get those extra attacks that you're entitled to, because I think that's kind of I think that's fair, personally. and it helps out other classes that are trying to be melee oriented and may not normally get those extra attacks that they probably should get compared to all the other options out there. Because I mean, if you're going to be going into melee, you might as well get what you invest into, which is a lot of this. Then we have Shadow Dancer, which is basically a stealth oriented class. You get bonuses to your stealth abilities. You get Hide in Plain Sight, which is very good because you can do that even if enemies can see you, and you can run away with that. And then you get Shadow Step, which allows you to kind of move around, and I think you can like set traps while you're in Shadow Step or do other things. So you can't attack or cast spells, but it can allow you to move around pretty well while others can't really do anything about it or notice you. So if you want to open a door and go through without someone noticing you, then you can do like Shadow Step for that. Or if you want to backstab, then use something like Shadow Step to get out of a jam, or Hide in Plain Sight, then you can do that as well. Then you have the Slippery Mind, which gives you a bonus to your saving throws, which is pretty decent. It's not too big of a deal, but every little bit helps. Disadvantage is you get less backstab multiplier compared to most other thieves, so while you're really awesome at stealth, you're not quite as good at backstabbing as other thieves are, so you cap out at ×4 multiplier, and you don't get anything backstabbing wise until you get into a higher level. So they can be interesting for stealth type of characters. And well, I forgot, you can't use the set snare ability, so if you're using Shadow Step or Hide in Plain Sight, then you can't like set traps or anything because you don't get that ability, but you can do other things like moving around and maneuvering the battlefield basically after you backstab someone, for example, once you get your backstabbing going here. And you get less skill points per level, but again, it's not a huge deal, mainly because eventually you're going to get the skill points that you want for the skills anyway, because you focus on maybe 1 or 2 skills early on, and you just pump 1 or 2 skills instead of trying to pump all of them slowly. Then that usually works better, so that we can be really good at a couple of things instead of painfully average at all of them. So the skill points per level penalty isn't too bad for these subclasses. But it does make for a lot of dual classing requirements for these Shadow Dancer. So that means that you're not very likely to play a dual class Shadow Dancer because you need high everything for these. So it's an interesting class. Not as good at backstabbing, but very good for stealth. Then you have Bards. Bards, well, they're not the same thing that they are in 5th edition because their Bard Song is a lot different from Bardic Inspiration in 5th edition. And so you get some protection from fear effects here. And so it can get your party back in line, which is very good. And it makes sure that people do not like fail their morale checks when they're low on hit points. So it kind of keeps your party in line, kind of similar to a Cavalier does. Then you have, they get spellcasting and stuff similar to mages, but they don't get the same amounts of spells. But since bards get faster level progression, they don't need to get as many experience points to level up. They tend to level up faster than mages do, so spells that scale with your character level, it means that they can cast some of those spells better than mages can. They just don't get as many spells to cast, essentially, and they don't cap out as high as far as the higher level spells that they can get. And then they get the Pickpockets ability, so this will just steadily go up as they level up. It's not too terribly useful, but there are ways that you can temporarily raise it if you really want to try it and you don't have a thief in your party. Then you have weapons and stuff. They can kind of do similar to what rogues or thieves can do as far as weapons go. And they can get somewhat heavy armor and chainmail, but you need special armor to be able to cast spells while wearing armor. So if you're wearing like studded leather or chainmail, you can't cast your spells in combat while wearing your armor. So you have to kind of find some special armor to be able to cast spells while wearing armor. And they get a decent amount of weapons that they can use. They can't use shields for the most part, so you're going to mainly be using weapons or your Bard Song. It just depends on exactly what class you want to play. I would recommend doing a subclass instead of the regular bard because these things are more specialized and give you some more interesting options. You get the Blade, which is sort of the frontline fighter kind of bard. You get 2 weapon style fighting here, and you get some offensive and defensive spin abilities depending on what you want to do. Offensive spin gives you bonuses to your attacks and gives you more attacks. So basically you can get a really high amount of damage later on. +2 to hit and damage rolls, and you get an extra attack per round, so that's kind of similar to getting weapon specialization, all while dual wielding as well. And then all attacks doing maximum damage means that you don't even have to roll for the damage, you just deal tons of damage. The only disadvantage of it is that you cannot use it with haste. So if you want to go ahead and buff yourself with haste, you can't really do that while using your offensive spin. So it doesn't allow it to stack, which is kind of unfortunate because fighters can get all kinds of weapon specialization and they can get the haste spell cast on them so they can be super duper mighty fighters, whereas all you have is offensive spin. Defensive spin is very good. You get a nice big boost to your AC. It only lasts for 4 rounds, and the same thing for offensive spin. So these are kind of sporadic abilities, but they're very good when you do use them. So at the start of fights, if you want to avoid getting hit, then defensive spin gives you such a big boost to your armor class that essentially it'll be very difficult to hit you. But at higher levels, obviously some of these things can taper off because they only do so much compared to what a fighter can do, for example, or what spellcasting can do. So, and then obviously the disadvantages, they're kind of, I mean, they're not really relevant. Lore basically means that's how well you can identify like magic items, so the higher the lore value that you have, then the better chance of identifying magic items, or basically it unlocks the ability to identify like more rare magic items or more powerful magic items the higher that your lore is. So lore is basically like free identify items, but there's an identifying spell that you can learn that can kind of make it to where you don't miss lore value at all. So that's one of the special things of bards, I think, is that you get increased lore as you level up. So getting a penalty to lore and pickpockets is not really a big deal. It's basically getting these things for free. Lore and pickpockets just aren't terribly useful. Jester is like a debuffing kind of bard, where your bard song, instead of helping out allies, it ends up trying to impose penalties on enemies. It can be interesting to just go around and singing your bard song and be like, da 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 da, you're confused, da 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 da, and just point your fingers around and be like, yeah, you get confused, you get confused, you all get confused. But the problem with the Jester is that they get a bonus to their saving throws against your bard song here. So it's kind of a, not really a catch-22, but it's a big trade-off on your bard song. While it's good to be able to confuse enemies, they get a +2 bonus to your saving throws, and strong enemies are going to have pretty good saving throws already. So against the enemies where you really want to be able to debuff them or use crowd control, it's not really all that great sometimes. So it's a mixed bag, but hey, you know, if you want to play a Jester and you aren't able to go and play one the way that you want to in like Gauntlet Legends, for example, then yeah, you can play a Jester here and kind of have fun with that however you want. Then we get my favorite kit of the bards, which is the Skald. This is kind of similar to a Valor Bard in 5th edition D&D. So they're, in my opinion, the best bard, and they get a +1 flat bonus to hit and damage rolls, which means that they're not reliant on sporadic spinning abilities like the Blade is. So they can get a flat bonus to that, which is nice. And then they get a very good bard song, which buffs allies to hit and damage rolls, and AC bonus. So if you have lots of fighters in your party, or lots of archers in your party, this is a very good class to play. And in fact, this is probably one of the easiest classes to play as a newcomer, because you can go through a lot of the game just using your bard song to buff up your allies and play around with the allies and the classes that they have in the game. and then allows you to learn more about the game while providing a very nice party buff and being generally all around good, because you get a good to hit and damage bonus if you want to use like ranged weapons, for example. And the bards can use a pretty wide array of weapons. So if you want to be a Skald and get that to hit and damage bonus, then you can get into melee decently, while also benefiting allies if you want to play in a melee heavy party or an archer heavy party, or a mix of both. And the only disadvantage is less pickpockets, but I mean, pickpockets isn't really all that great, so it's a very good trade-off, and I love this class. So for anyone who's a newcomer, this is another really good class to play, along with Cavalier Paladin, for example. Then we have Sorcerer, which is kind of similar to Mage, but kind of like in 5th edition. You don't learn spells by scribing scrolls into a spell book or something like that. You just kind of learn them as you level up, and you keep them forever. And you don't generally swap out spells as far as like memorization goes. So you don't have to memorize spells. Instead, you just know spells and you can cast them whenever you want with your spell slots. But they are a little bit different in that they do get a subclass option here, as well as a subclass that I installed via mods with the Pale Master. So sorcerers, they get the same amount of hit points as a mage does, unless you're a dragon disciple and you get a bit more with the hit die there. So sorcerers, they aren't exactly great for beginners, because you have to know what spells are good and what spells are crap, because once you pick a spell, you can't just swap it out like you can in 5th edition for a different spell. So play it once you're familiar with the game. Maybe not a first playthrough character, but maybe for a second or a third playthrough, you can kind of get an idea of what you want to do with them, compared to just like a regular mage where you can swap out spells that you are memorizing. So the Dragon Disciple kit is sort of, it gets like defensive bonuses essentially. So if you want to go ahead and play a tankier sort of mage that isn't going to die quite as often if the enemies target them, then they can do alright. They get some extra fire resistance as they gain levels. They get a breath weapon attack, kind of like Dragonborn do in 5th edition D&D. So if you want like an extra offensive ability for an area of effect damage, then breath weapon can be good. The only problem is that you have to get into melee range for that, and you can't really wear armor, so you have to kind of buff yourself up with spells, then go in and use your breath weapon. So there are some trade-offs, since you don't get as many spells that you can cast, so that is a big trade-off. So you don't get as much spell casting, but as you level up, you get some really nice defensive bonuses that add to your survivability, and the extra hit points is very nice, so that way you're getting almost as many hit points as a Cleric would, considering that you get your bonuses to Constitution here. And fire resistance is obviously very nice, since it can be, in a lot of cases in both tabletop and video games, fire is a pretty common damage type, so that's always very welcome. And the bonus to AC allows you to go ahead and, if you wish, you can try and gish with them. No rhyme intended there, but it's the one way that you can try and wade yourself in the melee as a single class or spellcaster with mage spells. Since you get your AC bonuses, you get extra constitution, and you get extra hit points, and you get your mage defensive spells. The only bad thing is that your weapon options are pretty limited, because you don't get to wear any armor. Your weapons are basically the same as mages. You can't get a fighting style, and you can't multi-class or dual class as a sorcerer. So your options are still limited as a Dragon Disciple. But if you want to go in there with a dagger, then I mean that might still be an option, depending. So mainly this is a survivability class for a full spellcaster. But you don't get as many spells, so you don't get to fling around as many fireballs or stuff. Pale Master is something that I added in via mods. So Pale Master is sort of a necromancy kind of class that's kind of like an evil. It's kind of like an evil kind of subclass if you want to play an arcane caster with an evil type that's not a necromancer mage. So you gain Bone Skin, which is a defensive buff, and then Animate Dead, which is like summoning undead to fight for you, so pretty common. You have a good idea of what that'll do. You summon undead warriors to fight for you. Deathless Vigor, sort of another defensive bonus there, or you get some bonuses here that are really good for your defenses. And then you get some more stuff that's going on here thematically. And so you get some extra abilities as you level up here that are based around undead, and you kind of grow more attuned to undead and evil sort of stuff like that. So you get some more defensive bonuses here. And then you get some more extra sort of secondary kind of abilities and extra summoning kind of abilities and bonuses and things like that. So you get extra undead kind of based like abilities and dark power abilities and stuff like that. And a little bit of extra hit dice, so you're a bit more durable than your standard spellcaster is. Now you get fewer spells that you can cast, but since you can summon undead and summon minions to fight for you, it kind of offsets not being able to cast as many spells because you can still cast good summoning magic. And then you can't be good alignment, obviously, because you're working with undead, so that's kind of a given. And less charisma, so you're not going to be like a party face or anything like that in all likelihood. You're going to be an ugly guy who's one with death and the undead. So then you have monks here, which in the first game, they're crap. They suck. They suck so hard in the first game, unfortunately. I love the flavor of monks, don't get me wrong, but in the first game they just suck so hard. But in the second game they get a lot better. So if you don't play them through the first game unless you just want to bear with it until you get to the second game when they get good. So monks, they're kind of the unarmed fighting class. They don't use weapons very well. They basically get equivalent to thieves as far as weapons and fighting styles go. And then they can't... Yeah, they get single weapon style, but no other fighting styles. So, I mean, they're not going to be able to do much with weapons. They're mainly fist fighters. They have faster movement, and they gain more movement as they level up. Unfortunately, movement isn't too important in this game, except for closing in on spellcasters. Because things happen simultaneously, and there aren't, like, opportunity attacks, like in 5th edition D&D. Faster movement speed isn't quite as useful in these games, but you can close in on spellcasters very fast to make melee attacks on them. And then you get your unarmed attacks, and you get some nice damage die boost as you gain levels here. And then at level 9, you finally get magic weapons for your unarmed attacks. Sadly, the level cap for monks in this game is level 8, so you don't get this until the sequel, so you're kind of stuck with your crappy weapon skills to be able to get magic weapon attacks. And so, yeah, you're kind of stuck with your fists being kind of crappy weapons for a while. You don't get the damage boost that's significant until you get to around level 6 here, because 1d8 damage is basically the same as like a long sword and that kind of thing. So you have to wait until the sequel until they start getting good with their magic fist weapons. They get a bonus to saving throws against spells, and then they end up also getting, later on, they get magic resistance here, which can be very good. Once you get the 14th level, you get 42% magic resistance, which is a very big boost from going from 13th level to 14th level, because it's a big one-time boost right at there at level 14, and then you get 3% more with each level. So if you want to play a Mage Slayer for the sequel, this is way better than the Wizard Slayer or Mage Slayer, than the Mage Slayer fighter class, since they get much more magic resistance and they get lots of unarmed attacks that they can use. And they get the bonus to saving throws and deflect missiles. They're very good against missile attacks. So at the higher levels, when they finally start getting good, they get really, really good because they have lots of defenses that are very hard to crack, and their fists can start finally counting as magical weapons to hit things. They get Stunning Blow, which allows you to go ahead and stun people with an attack. And so it's not quite as useful as it is in something like 5th edition D&D, where you can try and stun lock people, because saving throws are generally handled differently in this game and in these sort of older styled rules of D&D. And then you get some nice defensive bonuses again as you level up, and you eventually get lay on hands there. And then you can just attack super fast with speed factor and extra attacks with your fists as you gain higher levels. And then you get alignment restrictions here. So you can only be a lawful alignment, but that's not too bad. It still allows you to be good, evil, or neutral. And then becoming immune to non-magical weapons can be very good depending on the enemies that you're fighting. If they don't have magical attacks, or if they use unarmed claw attacks or something like that, then it can be very, very useful at the higher levels in the sequel. Dark Moon Monk is kind of like your evil monk, and so it's basically kind of like a shadow kind of monk, to where they get some sort of cold-based and illusion-based kind of abilities. So Frozen Fist is kind of like an offensive ability where you can kind of do some extra damage there with cold damage. And then you get some kind of evil kind of abilities here in Blur for some illusion magic. Vampiric Touch, which is kind of like a touch-based spell where you can kind of gain health from people. And Mirror Image is a very good defensive spell to be able to get. But again, you have to be evil, so if you don't want to be evil, then obviously this isn't the class that you can take. And you do trade off some other abilities to gain these abilities right here. Then you get Sun Soul Monk, which is basically the Good Aligned Monk subclass. So they get Sun Soul Ray, which is like a very good offensive ability, but you have to do that outdoors, I believe. So you can only use it in certain situations. I don't think you can use that outside, I don't think. And then you get Greater Sun, which is basically a defensive spell, defensive ability more like it, where you get extra fire resistance, which is very good because, like I said, it can generally be a common damage type that you encounter. And it can protect you from attacks as well, and it acts kind of like Fire Shield in 5th edition D&D, the spell Fire Shield. So that's a very good defensive ability here. And then you get Flaming Fists, which enhance your melee attacks with your fists, so you do some extra fire damage, and as you get a bunch of unarmed attacks, it gives you lots of extra damage because you get lots of attacks. And then you get Sun Soul Beam, which is basically another sort of offensive ability. I think that Sun Soul Ray might be different. I think that might be something you can use indoors, and it's sort of you know, comes from your palms, and you're just like, "Duh!" and you have the beam go at them that way. And I could be misreading these abilities, but I think that at least one of these is an outdoor-only ability that you can only use outdoors with, like, the sun or whatever, and you can't use them in, like, a dungeon. But yeah, Sun Soul Beam is basically a very good offensive-based ability, though you do have to make an attack roll to be able to hit them. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. You have to be able to hit them, but on the other hand, if you do hit them, you do lots of damage. And then they also have to save versus spell or be blinded for 2 hours. And then obviously it's a good aligned monk only, and you don't get the Stunning Blow or Quivering Palm, but it's a very good secondary abilities here, and Flaming Fist will enhance your fist attacks quite a bit. And then Quivering Palm, this is similar to the one that you can get in 5th edition D&D, I believe, with the Open Hand Monk. So you can have him save versus spell or just instantly die. So it's like a high level ability to where you can just try and deal with enemies without having to hit them quite as much. Granted, the saving throws for the higher level enemies are going to be good enough to where they can resist this quite a lot, but if it works, then it's great. But if it doesn't work, then damn it. You know what I mean? And then lastly, we have the Shaman, which was added in via a recent patch. So this is a more recent addition to the Baldur's Gate Enhanced Edition game. It's kind of like a Druid, but in Sorcerer form. So you kind of learn spells the way that Sorcerers do, and you gain some secondary abilities here with spirits and things like that. I am not very familiar with the Shaman. I never really played with one before, so I can't really tell you too much about it, other than the fact if you want to play a Druid with different flavor, then you can do that. And you get a Shamanic Dance, which is basically a... you're very vulnerable while you do this, but it gives you a chance for cool things to happen, basically. So if you want to play something that's like a mixture of Druid, Sorcerer, and Wild Mage, then Shaman might be your cup of tea. Alright, so I'm just going to go ahead and back up here a little bit, so that way I can give you a brief overview of the multi-class options. So these are most of the multi-class options. The half-elf has the widest array of multi-classes to choose from. Non-humans also, like elves or half-orcs, can get their own multi-class options. But Fighter Mage is pretty strong, and you combine abilities of different classes. Fighter Cleric, can have his various strengths. Fighter Mage Thief, again, more various strengths. Even though it has limitations, you can get around that with things like spells and good abilities that you can use. And then Fighter Thief, you can backstab while having Fighter Thaco and hit points, which is your to-hit chance for backstabbing, and you can still be durable enough to where you're not going to go ahead and die as often. And then you have like Mage Thief. You can combine different abilities of these different classes. And then I'm going to go back here and go back to Human, so that way I can show you some more with this class. Since I'm going to be a Swashbuckler, I'm just going to show you how I would be kind of doing things with a Swashbuckler. Then you have different alignments here. Lawful Good isn't on here because thieves can only be these alignments. They cannot be lawful good, so that's not really a big deal, but they have a flavor text descriptions of the different alignments here, and you can pause the game if you want to read those of what you might think of playing. It's slightly different than the descriptions that you might have in a 5th edition manual, and again, you can pause the game to read these. But they're a bit self-explanatory. A lot of it's just flavor. You don't have to strictly do things that are purely lawful evil or purely chaotic neutral or whatnot. But usually it's just like a good measure of what your character might do and what you might flavor your character as. It doesn't always play a role, but in some cases in the sequel it might, where things are more taken into account as far as that goes. And then this is one of the most important screens in the game. This is the stats screen, and this is where you can either roll your stats, or you can just locate what you have into other things. So if you want to be a rogue, you want to have like a high dexterity, for example, since that influences thief abilities and your armor class and your ability to do ranged attacks as far as your to-hit chance. Constitution is hit points and stuff like that, and it also influences your saving throw bonuses for the shorty races like dwarves, halflings, and gnomes. Strength is melee damage, and your chance to hit in melee can also be improved by having a high strength, and you get lots of good damage bonuses with high strength. Fighter types get what's called a fighter strength table. I'll go ahead and go back here so I can show you that. And then Lawful Good, this has this thing right here, and so you can read the flavor text there. So fighters, they get the fighter strength table in the older edition of games. So strength works in a way to where if you have 18 strength as a fighter, ranger, or a paladin, or a multi-class fighter or ranger, then you get the fighter sort of strength table, the warrior strength table. Basically, the fighter strength table goes on a scale of 1 to 100 for various different variances of 18 strength. So 18-1 is the lowest that you can have, and then 18-100, which would be represented by 18-0-0, is the highest that you can get with the 18 strength. So like 18-2 is a very low 18 strength, so it's only slightly higher than normal 18 strength, which is what, like, say, thieves or clerics would get. by default. They can't get the fighter strength table or whatnot. So it gives variances on the melee bonuses that you can get with the high strength values. You might love it, you might hate it, but that's the way it is in the older editions. Intelligence is the prime requisite, or prime stat for a mage. So it influences the maximum level of spells that you can learn, as well as your chance to scribe scrolls. I'm using a mod where you don't have to worry about scribing scrolls, you just automatically learn the spell if you scribe it from a scroll. So it gets rid of that annoyance to where you might have a chance of not learning the spell if you try and scribe it. Mainly because, like, people might already use scathe scumming to try and learn all the spells without failing to scribe them. And sometimes if a spell is rare or hard to get, then if you fail to scribe it, then it's very annoying that you miss out on that spell if it's very rare or expensive. So I have a mod to where basically no matter what your intelligence is, as long as you can scribe the scroll, then you automatically scribe it. And then Wisdom is the main stat for Clerics and Druids, and it basically it ends up giving them extra spells per... It gives them some extra spell slots to work with if you have a higher Wisdom to work with. And it also it helps to influence, you know, general things. There are some things that might influence aside from spell casting for Clerics and Druids, but that's the main thing that it influences. Charisma is more of a flavor stat in these games. It influences some conversation options and buying and selling prices. And sometimes you might get a better quest reward or mission reward if you have a higher charisma to kind of influence people of your way. So it's more of a secondary skill, and it can be useful for party leaders. It might be helpful for making sure that people don't have morale failure in combat if you have a leader of high charisma. I'm not for certain if that affects anything like that, but it's just a theory that I have that higher charisma for your party leader means that your companions and your party are not as likely to have morale failure in combat and try running away. But Bards and Paladins, it's supposed to be important for them. Not really, it doesn't really affect all that much in combat or with their abilities, but it is flavor, and so flavor can be good if you like that sort of thing. And Bards and Paladins also have a minimum charisma requirement of like 15 and 17 respectively. So you have to have a good charisma as these two classes, and if you want to dual class as a druid in any way, then you need a pretty good charisma for that. And you can re-roll stats here, and that's your total roll, so obviously a higher roll is better. 75 is the lowest roll that you can have in the game, and then the highest that you can get, but is exceptionally rare, is 100. Usually if you get a roll of 90 or higher, then you're pretty much set for most classes that you can play, except for maybe a multi-class combination where you might have to have a spellcasting stat fairly high along with your physical stats, like a fighter mage or a fighter cleric, for example. But you can spend time re-rolling stats. Personally, I don't do that. I just use EEKeeper to edit the character files after I create a character to give them the stats that I feel are thematic for them. So that way I don't have to worry about spending half an hour trying to roll stats like this, because it's rare to get a good roll. And rather than leave it up to chance and spend time doing all of this, I just go ahead and pick, you know, random stats or whatever here, roll with them, and then I go out of game and use the save game editor to change these as I feel fits the character. And then these are all of your weapon skills. So these are all the weapons that you can choose from. Fighters, paladins, and rangers get access to all weapons. Thieves and clerics get access to only special amounts of weapons, and same for monks. Bards can use, I think, all kinds of weapons on this list, but they can't get very many points into any... they can only get 1 point into weapons or fighting styles. Fighters can start up with up to 2 points in a fighting style at the start, and with any one weapon. And you can get up to 5 points in any of these weapon skills as a fighter as you level up. So you can start off with 2 and get up to 5 later on. And then with fighting styles, you can get 2 points in the two-handed weapon style, sword and shield style, and single weapon style. Two-weapon style you can get up to 3 points in. You only need to start off with 2 points because that mitigates any penalty with your main hand weapon, and then basically the third slot just mitigates the penalty for the offhand weapon. But once you have 2 points in dual wielding, then you can start dual wielding with no penalty to your main weapon. So it's basically like an extra attacks with your offhand weapon there. And two-weapon fighting can also be pretty good, because as far as magic weapon options go, it means that you can use multiple magic weapons. So you can use one magic weapon in one hand and then one in the other, and they might have interesting kind of abilities that you can do with those, or extra boosts that you get, or just extra damage output in general, which is nice. Two-handed weapon style is also very good because it allows you to go ahead and do more critical hits, which means really high damage hits, and an extra flat bonus to damage rolls, which is nice because two-handed weapons generally do a good amount of damage, like two-handed swords or halberds. And quarterstaffs also qualify for two-handed style, so that's also very good if you're playing, say, a Cleric that wants to go with two-handed weapons. Then two-handed fighting style can give you an extra boost here. Specialized and two-handed style is nice to have, but not essential. So if you don't have this, then speed factor basically means that you attack earlier in the round with your weapon. So it's like a bonus to your initiative, basically, comparative to 5th edition. In 5th edition, you have initiative to see if you go first. And this game's speed factor of your weapon and speed factor bonuses basically allow you to attack earlier in the round with your attacks. Single weapon style, kind of similar to two-handed style, gives you a bonus chance to do critical hits, and it also gives you a bonus to your AC. So let's say if you're a thief that can't really use shields that are worth much, and you want to be able to have a higher chance of critical hits with backstabbing, then single weapon style can be pretty good there. Or if you want to do crit fishing with a very strong weapon, then you can also do that as well, while still getting a bonus to your AC without using a shield. This can also be pretty decent on bards to get the extra AC and the higher critical hit chance while still using decent weapons, like say for a Scald. A Scald could go ahead and use the single weapon style for the crit fishing there. And then you got all your different kinds of weapons here, and so they're all self-explanatory. They have flavor text depending on what kind of weapon they are and the nature of the weapon. And you have a good amount of weapon types here. Katanas are exceedingly rare, and so in the first game, it's not really recommended that you play with using katanas, because they are the rarest weapon type, because they were not originally in the first Baldur's Gate game. So Beamdog, when they made the enhanced editions, they had to add in a couple of katanas for you to have the option of playing with them. This is more of a thing in the second game, where they were native to the game when it was originally released. So katanas are more of a thing for the second game if you want to go for those. My character will be going with katanas, but that's because I know ways to kind of get around it and deal with the limited options in the first game, but it's not newcomer friendly. So I'd go with other options, and then maybe in the second game you can start using a katana if you want to. And then, like, you have warhammers and blunt options. The only weapons that I would recommend that you not get, at least for a first-time player, or any kind of newcomer, but in general I don't like darts, I don't like spears, and I don't like clubs. It's nothing against those weapons. I mean, thematically they're fine. Spears is a fine weapon in 5th edition D&D. But it all comes down to having good magic weapon options, right? So magic weapon options are what influence, what enemies that you can hit at higher levels, how strong your weapons are, and what your options are, and just having access to good equipment options. But a spear, club, and darts, you don't really get good options, and darts aren't really the best ranged weapon option if you want to get ranged weapons going. The one advantage of darts is that you get a bonus to your damage rolls based on your strength, because they're a throwing weapon. And slings are the same thing, you get a bonus to your damage rolls with your strength. So darts and slings, if you have a high strength, can be good, but I wouldn't really recommend darts because you run out of ammo pretty fast for them, depending on what you want to do with them. And you also, throughout the game, you might also get throwing axes and throwing daggers. So throwing axes and throwing daggers can be a thing if you want to use throwing weapons, and so if you take daggers as an option, then you can get throwing daggers as a ranged weapon option. Even if you don't have, say, longbow proficiency, you can just use throwing daggers as an alternative and go with like single weapon style, for example. And then appearance, you have like lots of different color schemes that you can go with to choose for your character. You have hair right here that you can choose. Skin color, so if you want to be a funky looking human or a funky looking elf, you can do that. Clothing is like, this is like your main tunic there that you influence the color of. And then the minor is like the stripes and stuff that's on like your clothing and such. Alright, and so we got funky looking colors going on there. And then this is where you select your voice sets. So voice sets, you know, it depends on what you want for your character. A fighter might have a certain voice type. A thief might have a certain voice type. I have mods that add in some extra voice sets. Baldur's Gate 2 voice sets are here that I added in because in the first game, for some reason, they don't have them in by default. So Baldur's Gate 2 female voice sets, Baldur's Gate 2 male voice sets. These voice sets right here are like female voice sets from the Icewind Dale games, which came later after Baldur's Gate, but they use the same engine with the Infinity engine. And then these are the male voice sets from the Icewind Dale games, so it gives you more options than the base game gives you as far as you have the original voice sets that were from the original game, like the default option here.
To battle!
Then you have these options, which are available in the Enhanced Edition. And then these options are available for males in the Enhanced Edition, but you get so many more options via mods that it's such a nice thing to have based on the kind of flavor that you might want to have with your character.
Death will come swiftly for you.
The voice volume is a bit down for me, just because when it comes to actual gameplay, if you're doing a Let's Play, you just don't want your voice to be overpowered by the voice sets.
Your life shall be mine.
But you get some different options here. And for the male characters, you can obviously pick another default voice here for the male character. I think they had that in the original game. If you're like a new player and you don't know which one to pick, you can just go with the default option, which is a pretty decent option. Then you finally pick your name. The name of my character is going to be Vistra, and that's just a random name, you know, no relation to any sort of fiction out there, no relation to Latin or any kind of pop culture reference or anything. I just like coming up with different random names that I can use. And then you can go ahead and export them and give them a name. I've already exported them in particular. So you can do that if you want to go and export them and save them for later. So if you want to make a bunch of characters and pre-generate them, then you go ahead and you do that, and then you can save them for later to use for when you might feel in the mood to play that class. Or if you want to play multiple playthroughs at the same time, that's also a thing. And then for flavor, you have biography. You can go ahead and type in whatever you want here. I'm not sure if I don't think it really affects the game, but it does give you a bit of background to what your backstory might be before you enter the game. So it's kind of flavor text. Some joinable NPCs will also have biographies that you can look at when you get them to join your party. So you can take a look at these for NPC characters that join you in your travels as well. But I just want to go through character creation here and give people an idea of what playing the game might be like. And I'm a bit more of a thorough person as far as Let's Playing and kind of explaining things throughout here. So this might be a bit of a lengthy video, but this is just more for newcomers and people that may not be familiar with the game that still either want to watch the Let's Play because they think the idea of it is cool, or if they want to get into playing these games because they got into D&D from 5th edition, but the rules are different, and so how the game plays is a lot different. But yeah, you can also use custom portraits. The default custom portrait resolution for the large size is 210 by 330 resolution for the portrait, and you need that in bitmap, the bitmap format, which is BMP for short. So if you want to make a custom character portrait for your character, you can just find whatever portrait that you want, or you can have an artist commissioned to draw you something, and then you can use it in the game. But yeah, so that goes through all of character creation for part 0. I hope that you guys all enjoy this, even if it's a bit long-winded, and even if I'm kind of getting out of breath here from talking so much, but I hope that you all enjoyed it, and I'll see you guys next time for the part 1, where me and a good friend of mine will get together for a multiplayer Let's Play of this game, and for hopefully the sequel down the road. So I'll see you guys next time, and everyone take care. This is thelovebat, signing out.